Hey everybody, this is Ian Shell. I am the author and the narrator of this series, Hyper-Borea. Thanks for listening, everybody, and I just wanted to say that the comment section is open, so I would love to receive feedback on this series. Please comment your likes, dislikes, comments, or compliments, criticisms. If you have any questions, that would be awesome. The like button above, you can also hit that, and that will enable more people to see the series promoted on YouTube. But you can also share the URL with anybody that you know, whether it be just messaging friends or sharing it on your timeline. In the description are a lot of helpful links. We've got my blog, which I'm posting the book for free, chapter by chapter, just as I'm doing here on YouTube. You can follow along as the release comes week by week, or the Amazon link is there too. If you want to buy the book, whether digitally or a physical copy, you can do that as well. It's way cheaper to do it digitally, so I encourage that. And finally, my Twitter's on there. If you want to communicate with me on there or engage with me on there, that's open to you as well. I really appreciate you guys, and I look forward to reading your comments. The debris littering the hallways was primarily stone of differing shades and hues. This was for various reasons. The major variable was what type of projectile had exploded through what wall. The fortress of Marlon was actually an old castle within a new one. The original had been built by the king's grandfather, King Ardalador, but for a more peaceful time. Its walls were brown, stone, yet thin. Marlon had had a thicker layer of gray stone added to the outside, and to the exterior ramparts, which were heightened and strengthened as well. It was gray and brown chunks, aplenty with burn marks of purple, blue, orange, and black. Several were still covered in ice or crystal shards. Some had streaks of lightning burnt into them, like the scars present on the Alfman beside the king. "The castle is secured, my liege. The black one—" "Cormal," the king corrected. They needed to be careful to remember they were dealing with Alfmen, not legends, nor creatures from the void. "Yes, my liege. Cormal has raised his own dead and departed with the crystal Zyrith," informed General Barlin, a stocky Alfman of medium height with the scar of a lightning burn running up his leg to the top of his head. He wore fine silver steel armor, as did most of the king's loyalists. However, he also wore the tabard of the king's general, a crown inlaid in a starburst on purple. "Just as my lord Arcanist had said he would." Sovos, despite his arrogance and oversized ego, had proved correct time and time again. There were loyalist masters in the skies at the moment, carrying out the next portion of a plan hatched by the two of them prior to the Grand Master's departure. The king and his escort were in the feasting hall then. The carnage here was most absolute, given the concentration of masters battling in one location. By the entrance stood a half-dozen darkened ones, turned to stone as they had charged through the battered gate. A few of the enemy who had died in more gruesome ways were not bothered with when it came time to raise the dead as zombie servants. Those left behind lay in pieces, leaving the air stinking of rotting flesh and burnt meat. This must have been what castles in other lands smelled like after a battle, but while this fortress had started out immaculately clean due to the technology and magic of the Alfmen, those castles Marlon had visited were anything but. The poorest Alfman had a standard of living on par with the higher castes of other civilizations. When the king was but a prince, he had visited foreign lands with several masters portraying himself as a student and not royalty. The castle floors were covered in hay to absorb the feces of rats, cats, and occasionally a dog or slave. Not only that, but often the castles lacked running water, and thus cesspits in summer left the whole place reeking of months-old human waste. Yes, even in the state of ruined battle, King Marlon would rather put to bed here than the alternatives. "Here lies Master Ilfnir," said Barlan, standing over the old robed man. The king stepped over and gave the face a last look. Whatever had killed him, Marlon was not sure how fast it had been. He possessed superficial cuts on the arms where his robe was torn, but his face was ghost white, and dried blood wept from his eyes, ears, nostrils, and mouth. "To Valhalla, Master Ilfnir." Marlon lowered his head in respect. They had lost many great masters and warriors in the Battle of Marlon Fortress. To attack the Isle of Yig was not only blasphemous, it was foreseen. Cormal and his wretched wife feared Master Sovos and his attempt at Rensharo. It was enough to bait them into action. Sovos had predicted that they would attack, and he had stated that they must be allowed to take the Great Crystal. That was tough for the king. Battle was not common in an Alfheim king's lifetime. Marlon did not want to lose. "But you must, for the sake of our country," Sovos had said. The king had had to remind himself of that when he found Cormal in the sights of his crossbow. He could have ended the rogue master there and then, but the forces coalescing against his land and people would find another leader, and the struggle would continue without end. So instead, Marlon fired a shot to disable Cormal, then made a point to be seen retreating. He mustered his forces he had placed in reserve beyond the castle walls. Then they had returned. Zyreth, a godly artifact, would give off a magnificent magical energy signature that the masters could track. Cormal knew this, but his hand was forced with Rensharo. The king and Sovos sent fake ledgers out with the goal of having them intercepted by Cormal and his dark forces. The orders would show soldiers from the fortress instructed to be sent out to reinforce outlying islands. They were careful to word them, giving them an air of haughty Sovos arrogance. They stated in a more dressed-up manner that the Dark Ones would never attack Yig. This was enough to make Cormal comfortable, and seeing the ritual on the horizon, he acted. Now the crystal was on its way to one of 3 locations. Scroll was the favorite. Scroll had been a distant island along the border of the Ice Sea and the Riffian Mountains. It was smaller, and years prior had been a contested territory as various groups among the guilds, societies, and colleges were vying for rights to make use of it. The king had 2 scrolls he liked best for the contest, one from his lord arcanist and one from the guildmaster of the mining guild. The king had forced a compromise after the endorsement of Sovos's claim by a well-respected master and historian by the name of Master Throwan. Scroll had 1 beach, the rest of the island inaccessible, given high walls of rock and brutal waves. Since Scroll was a border island, there were no other islands between it and the Ice Sea, thus nothing to act as a wave break before its shores. The northeast corner of the rounded square plot of land was home to the only gentle landing place, a beach and a small harbor, which had been erected to allow for the facilitation of labor and study. The king's compromise giving research rights to the College of Mages, while the labor, and thus the ore, was by right to belong to the miners. The guild had rejoiced in its role in a fantastic discovery, a massive spire buried deep in the island. The spire spiraled down and down into the earth, and its ramps and rounds were home to innumerable tombs of ancient elfmen and women. In one of the largest rooms discovered, Master Throwan and a team of lesser masters and apprentices had found a scroll with some form of prophecy scrawled in the language of the gods. This was the so-called Spire of Draugdrotten, Draugdrotten being a name of the chief of the gods, Odin. It meant Lord of the Undead. The spire was immediately worked upon by every Master Sovos could get his hands on, and was raised from the ground to tower over Scroll. Upon approach of the island, the black-brown corkscrew would be seen first, as it was now in the open air, 50 stories tall. This made it more accessible, instead of being hidden underground with one entrance. Now masters could fly to the separate parts, and be granted more natural lighting and ventilation through newly and carefully carved holes in the wall. Scroll was the favorite because of the great many corpses of once powerful but now deceased kings and masters of ancient Alfheim. Sovos believed Cormal would take to the summit of the spire and use Zyreth to absorb the powers of the ancient dead to destroy Alfheim. This would be done by the ritual of Verkostog, the prophesied ceremony that would bring apart Alfheim and scatter her citizens across the world. Cormal could know something that the king and his arcanist did not, however, and that is why 2 other locations were likely. Corcel, the island of the Black Mountain, where the campus of histories was located, among them. Corcel had been cursed during an ancient war. It had taken a tremendous amount of magical energy to dispel that curse. This latent energy left over could be harnessed. Along with the curse, which had made the earth there black, the college's campus of histories possessed many lesser artifacts that could be used in the ritual. Lastly, there was Tol Akor, the island where kings were born and buried as of the past few hundred years. The smallest of the three, it is a beautiful refuge with castles of marble and lush gardens. Only royal blood is allowed to tread the soil beyond the docks, all the chores tended to by enchanted golems and constructs. Tolokor was sparsely inhabited at the moment, with just Marlan's two sisters and their families. Again, unless Cormal knew something they did not, Scroll was the most likely place. They could not be certain, given the defecting masters had taken troves of artifacts and literature with them. "My king," Barlin was at his side again. "Our scouts report that most of our navy has defected with Cormal, and that the Dark Ones sail southwest." He was neither frantic nor calm. The loss of the bulk of the Loyalist ships was expected, though they had made attempts to put off that inevitability. Admiral Virel was under investigation for inappropriate use of necromancy, and had been detained in the city of Yig. The charge was superfluous. The real reason for his detainment had been compromising letters from who they now knew was Cormal on his person. Marlan supposed he would hear of the Admiral's premature release from custody, and Cormal's escape by sea very soon. The navy was not necessary, and it seemed the question had been answered. Southwest lay Scroll, and the spire of Draugdrotten. In his booming voice the king issued several commands, finishing with, "Summon only what corvettes and fast ships we have left, and ready the war griffins. We must move quickly." As the great room animated with fresh purpose, the king walked the familiar halls of his personal fortress toward the main gates and yard. He would go by horse to a private harbor, not far distant from the castle, and they would depart from there. Marlan longed for the day that all of this was theory. It wasn't long ago. He thought back on those times as he walked. The sun had still been up, the time about 9 in the evening. They were at the sprawling royal estates above the city of Yig, jutting from a cliff of one of the most prominent hills on the island. A guard stood within eyesight but not earshot. Even if anyone could hear their voices, their speech would seem garbled, as Sovos filtered their language, with an enchanted ward in real time. The king's mansion had lush gardens, beautifully carved hedges, marble pillars, walls, and fountains, and they sat plotting amongst flowering bushes and creeping vines. The wizard had been standing, practicing a spell, while the king was deeply pensive. "The criers have been detained and questioned, but it is not a crime to speak of dark prophecies in public." "So they will be released?" It was not a question. Sovos was speaking in an uncommitted tone, his focus not on the king, but on his magic. He had been attempting this spell for months during their meetings. Dua Gol Kalin, two ghost kin. The way the mage had explained it to the king was that he believed he could conjure a mirror image of himself. "I have read the scrolls that describe such a feat," he had said, speaking the words then. Dua Gwa Qualin. His success being a clone that appeared and disappeared like a fine mist blown by a passing wind. "Stating in public that the end is near is not a crime, even when yelled in a busy square." The king was relaxed, seated in a plush recliner, a jeweled goblet of mead in hand. "We have masters at our fingertips, the finest warriors, yet we cannot ascertain even a shred of information on the identities of those who would destroy our home. It is frustrating," Sovos finished for him. The mage's eyes closed, muttering, "Dua Gwa Qualin." He paused, breathed. "Alfmen are superstitious. Alfmen believe in destiny and the gods. It is destiny ordained by the gods that Rakgastog comes to pass. The only question is when. It would not be an Alfman to betray his personal beliefs." "Sometimes I wonder if you should be king and not me, Sovos." The wizard broke his concentration then to laugh. "Your Highness, please." He turned then. "I much enjoy my station more. I can't imagine having to complete some of your," his lip curled, "more insufferable tasks." "Such as hearing the grievances of our people in court?" The king smiled then. He knew this would be his arcanist's reaction. The thought of Sovos listening to the problems of the common folk all day was a thought to find amusement in. The wizard would pull the hair from his own head with impatience. There was a silence then, and Sovos continued to practice his spell. "Do you still believe Cormal to be the chosen one to lead the others in Rakgastog?" "He's arrogant enough, has the training." Sovos moved his hands through the air slowly, his mind elsewhere. "He certainly is the one I would finger for the job." He muttered the words, "Dua Gwa Kalin." For a moment there was a shimmer, a second Sovos. Just for a moment, though. "The lambs in the woods. What can we expect next?" People. Sovos had personally investigated the lambs. On some of the outlying islands of Alfheim, in the darkest woods, some townsfolk had discovered brutal scenes of animal entrails strewn across sacrificial scenes, bloody ruins, bone ornaments, skulls. Evidence of these small ceremonies were being discovered all over the archipelago. They were hallowing the islands, preparing them as one primed wood before painting. Next it would shift to human sacrifices, as the Dark Ones buttered up the gods before asking for a blessing to churn the islands into their vision, into the land's destiny. Sacrilege. Marlon's face was in his hands then. They will seek a catalyst for their ceremony. Somewhere in Alfheim that they can channel unimpeded. Somewhere with plenty of latent magical resources they may draw from. Most like it will be somewhere with plenty of dead for their dark magic. I'm assuming you have an idea, the king asked. If I were Kormal, I would say the spire on scroll. What will it look like? The king looked to his arcanist. First they will need Zyreth. Rakostog will require an amount of casting previously unknown. I would be surprised if the Great Crystal were enough. He would likely focus the energy from the dead through it, and along with a few more masters effect change on the land in a manner to make it uninhabitable. What manner? Raise the level of the sea, curse the ground, explode the mountains, kill the vegetation, raise all the dead. Unfortunately, there are many ways to end a kingdom. To affect all of Alfheim, Zyreth and the Spire of Draugdrotten should be enough. We mustn't allow them time to prepare. The king stood then. We must bait them out. You wish it then? Sovos now focused on his liege. Rensharo, they will come for Zyreth. Let them come.